After the celebrated British actor Richard Griffiths passed away in 2013, his charming Georgian townhouse in Stratford-upon-Avon quietly lingered in the shadows of his legacy. Nestled on a narrow cobbled street just a 5-minute walk from the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, the house had once been full of warmth and wit, much like Griffiths himself. Locals remembered seeing him by the window, laughing with guests, often reading scripts in the garden, or chatting to the mailman in his dressing gown. But after his death, the house stood vacant for nearly a decade. In late 2023, a retired couple from Manchester, Paul and Elaine Whitaker, bought the property. Paul had spent his life as a primary school headteacher. Elaine was a retired nurse. They had fallen in love with the house the moment they saw it. Its ivy-covered brickwork, the original sash windows, the soft creak of wooden floorboards, and the fact that it had once belonged to one of their favorite actors only added to its charm. But from the day they moved in, something felt wrong. It began subtly. Paul would misplace things: his reading glasses, his pen, a half-finished crossword, only to find them exactly where he was certain he had left them the first time. Elaine would wake in the middle of the night hearing the stairs creak, but Paul was always fast asleep beside her. Within 2 weeks, she began seeing someone. A figure, briefly, in the corner of the hallway mirror, always turning just as she did. A tall man, balding, with a broad chest and dark clothing. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply looked, or rather loomed. One night, Elaine caught the scent of tobacco, a distinct, old-fashioned pipe drifting down the corridor, though neither she nor Paul smoked. The next day, she checked every window. All were shut. Every vent. Nothing. The house had a narrow staircase leading to a small upper floor with a single study room. They initially intended to turn it into a library, but every time Paul tried to stay in the room more than a few minutes, he became agitated. A headache. Short breath. Once, he said it felt like someone was standing directly behind him, breathing down his neck. Elaine noticed something else. Every time she dusted the bookshelves' original fixtures, old and painted over, the dust would return within an hour. Thicker, like no one had disturbed it for years. Then came the voice. One evening, Paul sat in the study reading, and heard a voice behind him. It wasn't menacing, but it was firm, British, commanding. "That's not where that goes." He turned. No one. But the voice stayed with him, inside his head, repeating itself with new phrases, sometimes correcting him, sometimes telling him to leave the light on. He didn't tell Elaine at first. Elaine, more curious than afraid, began documenting the strange occurrences. She left a small voice recorder running in the study overnight. The next morning, she listened. The tape was mostly silent, but in the final 10 minutes, a soft clunk, a whisper, and then something unmistakable. "Do you know what you've done?" Spoken as if through gritted teeth. Controlled rage. Male. Heavy breathing followed. Then silence. She deleted the file without telling Paul. That same week, a neighbor, Mrs. Dalloway, an old woman who had lived across the street since the 70s, came by with homemade scones. As she stood at the door, she peered past Elaine into the hallway and smiled strangely. "Still feels like he's there, doesn't it?" Elaine laughed nervously. "Who?" "Richard. He never left. Some spirits don't. Especially the loud ones." By January 2024, Paul wanted to leave. Elaine didn't. She felt attached, maybe even protective. But the turning point came one rainy night. They were both asleep when the sound of heavy footsteps thundered through the upper floor. Elaine rushed up first. No one. But the window in the study had flung open, banging in the storm. On the desk, carved into the wood, was a sentence neither of them had ever seen before. "Leave it as it was." They left within a week, packed what they could, locked the front door, and never returned. The Whitakers now live in Devon. They refuse interviews but did confirm their brief stay at Griffith's house. A real estate agent has since relisted the property, discreetly and off-market. Several buyers have expressed interest, but each has pulled out before closing. And every evening, as the streetlights cast their long shadows across Chapel Lane, the windows of Richard Griffiths' old home remain dark. Except, locals say, for the study where sometimes, just after midnight, A faint glow can be seen and the outline of a man sitting upright in a chair, reading something only he can see. Elaine sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea, watching the condensation gather on the windowpane. The house groaned softly as the wind pushed against it, the old wooden frame flexing like tired bones. It was late afternoon, midwinter, and a low gray sky pressed down over Stratford-upon-Avon like a damp blanket. The days were short, but the shadows inside the house stretched longer than they should, bleeding into corners where the sun never quite reached. She glanced up toward the ceiling, the study. Even thinking of that room made her tense. She hadn't gone up in 3 days. Not since the window incident, not since the carved message appeared on the desk. Paul had become quieter, his usual cheer replaced with a careful silence. He avoided the study entirely now, choosing instead to retreat to the garden shed, where he fiddled with his tools, claiming he needed space to breathe. But Elaine knew better. He was afraid. The kind of fear he didn't want to give voice to, as if naming it would make it more real. That night, as they sat together in the small sitting room, the television flickering with the soft hum of some old crime drama, a cold draft slipped across the floor, brushing Elaine's ankles like a whisper. She frowned and looked toward the hallway, half expecting to see the front door ajar. But it was closed, locked, the chain still drawn. And yet the cold persisted, not like a draft but something deliberate, something present. She didn't say anything, but Paul, without taking his eyes off the screen, muttered, "He's pacing again." Elaine turned sharply. "What?" Paul finally looked at her, his face pale. "Upstairs. I hear it when I close my eyes. Same rhythm. Like he's walking lines back and forth. Like rehearsing." "You don't hear it." She didn't. Not then. Paul was gone most of the day, an escape, really. He'd taken to volunteering at the local charity shop just to be out of the house. Elaine stayed behind, determined to reclaim some sense of ownership over the space. She dusted, rearranged books, opened windows to let air in. But the house pushed back. Rooms she had aired out in the morning smelled musty again by mid-afternoon. The hallway mirror fogged up as if someone had breathed on it. When she wiped it clean, her fingers left no streaks, but something else did. That evening, as dusk fell and the street lamps blinked to life outside, Elaine finally made her way upstairs to the study. She stood at the threshold for a long moment before pushing open the door. The air in the room was still, but not dead. It was the kind of stillness found in a theater moments before curtain. The light was soft, yellowed, from a small lamp left on the desk. She didn't remember turning it on. She stepped inside. Everything looked untouched, but the sensation of being watched was immediate, not threatening, but intense, like the scrutiny of a stern teacher. She crossed to the window, now latched shut, and looked out. Below, a young couple walked a dog, unaware of the woman peering down at them from a house full of old whispers. When she turned back, the chair behind the desk was pulled out. It hadn't been before. She stared at it for a long moment, heartbeat in her throat, trying to rationalize, but her thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a sound. A low thud, not loud, but close. It had come from the wardrobe in the corner of the room, a narrow, antique piece Griffiths had apparently used for storing coats and old costumes. Elaine hadn't opened it since they moved in. She stepped toward it slowly. Another sound, this time softer, almost like fabric shifting. She placed her hand on the handle, hesitated, then pulled it open. Nothing, just a coat, a long, thick wool coat, and a pair of shoes, old leather, cracked. But as she looked down at the shoes, something shifted in her chest, a memory, though not her own. The air around her felt charged, the kind of charge that lifts the hairs on your arms and neck. And then, faintly, like a line from a faraway play, she heard it. "Exit, pursued by a bear," spoken in a deep voice. Behind her, she spun around. No one. The room was empty, but the lamp on the desk flickered once, then twice, and finally went out. Elaine sat upright in bed, blankets pulled tight around her. Paul slept beside her, but she could tell it was a restless sleep. She could feel it in his breath, shallow and rapid. Then, without warning, a noise rang out from upstairs. Sharp, metal on wood, like a drawer slamming shut. Paul jolted awake. They locked eyes. "Stay here," he whispered, pulling on his robe. "No, Paul." But he was already out of bed, already creeping down the hall, up the stairs. Elaine followed a few steps behind, despite the cold crawling up her spine. When he reached the study, he stopped just short of the door. The light inside was on again. He opened it slowly. The desk drawer was wide open. Inside it, a stack of papers. Yellowed, handwritten, some curled at the edges. He stepped forward and picked one up. It was a monologue, Shakespearean, annotated in thick black pen. The margin was filled with notes, circled words, performance cues. Paul flipped through page after page, dozens of them, all marked by the same hand. And then a newer page, typed, not yellowed, still warm. Paul read aloud. "To the ones who live in my echo, I am not done." He set the page down slowly. Elaine stepped beside him. On the wall, above the desk, the mirror no longer reflected the room. It reflected a stage, empty, lit in a soft blue wash, with a single chair center. And just before the mirror went black, they both saw him, standing at the footlights, smiling. That night neither Paul nor Elaine slept. The house no longer felt merely haunted, it felt aware. And they now understood, perhaps too late, that their presence had triggered something dormant. Something theatrical. Something unfinished. The next morning, a cold fog settled over Stratford-upon-Avon, denser than usual. From the windows of the Griffiths house, the street outside was little more than a gray smear, the outlines of buildings softened and ghostly. Inside, the air was dry and unusually still. The house seemed to be waiting. Paul moved through the kitchen in silence, pouring tea with the shakiness of someone running on nerves instead of sleep. Elaine sat by the fireplace, watching the flames sputter behind the grate. She hadn't said much since they saw the image in the mirror. She kept replaying it in her mind, the empty stage, the glow, and the unmistakable figure of Richard Griffiths in shadow, smiling not at them, but through them, as though delivering his final bow, unseen by the world that had forgotten him. Paul cleared his throat and finally broke the silence. "We need to find out what's in this house." Elaine looked up slowly. "We already know." "No," he said, setting the cup down with a soft clink. "I mean everything. Every drawer, every board, every box in the attic. He's still here for a reason." Elaine hesitated, then nodded. The narrow stairwell to the attic had never felt right. Even during daylight, the steps creaked unnaturally, not like settling wood, but like responses to the feet that climbed them. The door was a pull-down panel with a short wooden ladder that extended with a metallic groan. Paul climbed first. Elaine followed with a flashlight. The attic was surprisingly clean, dry, insulated, with exposed beams and wooden flooring. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, swaying ever so slightly, though there was no draft. In the far corner, two trunks. One was small, green leather, cracked and dulled with time. The other was larger, black with brass fittings. Paul knelt before them, wiping dust off the top of the green trunk. It had initials burned into it. "RG." He opened it slowly. Inside were scripts, dozens, some handwritten, some typed, others printed on crisp white paper. But all of them bore notes. His notes, scribbled margins, crossed out lines, arrows and exclamations, pages stained with tea or maybe whiskey. The life of an actor poured into paper. Elaine lifted one, a dog-eared copy of Uncle Vanya. The page fell open to a highlighted line. A life spent rehearsing, and never quite performing. She looked to Paul. This is all he had. These are his memories. But Paul had opened the second trunk. His face went pale. "Elaine." She stepped over, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in her hand. Inside the larger trunk was something far stranger. Costumes, cloaks, vests, shirts with high collars, even wigs. And beneath them, a faded photograph album, pages cracking at the corners. They flipped it open. Most of the photos were of the house, from inside. Some were dated 1997, 2003, 2010. But one was new, dated 2024, just a few weeks ago. A photo of Elaine, standing in the hallway, looking into the mirror. She didn't remember anyone taking it. Then the next, Paul reading by the window. And then, the two of them asleep, in bed, from above. Elaine's hand flew to her mouth. Paul swore under his breath and stepped back from the trunk like it had burned him. The attic bulb flickered. Once, twice, and then stayed off. They left the attic in a rush, sealing it back as if shutting the lid on something ancient. Downstairs, Paul paced while Elaine picked up her phone. She searched online for anyone who had written about the house, about Griffiths, or about strange occurrences in Stratford. She found a blog. A literary historian who had written a post in 2018 about Richard's private life. Most of it was praise, but one paragraph stood out. Griffiths was known to perform entire monologues late at night to an empty room. Neighbors spoke of hearing muffled voices not arguing, but performing. He once told a friend, "I need to keep speaking the lines, or I'll forget who I am." There was something deeply tragic about that. Elaine reached out to the author, a woman named Marian Huxley, now in her 70s, still living nearby. They invited her to the house that afternoon. Marian arrived with a thin smile and a heavy scarf. She moved slowly with a slight limp, but her eyes were sharp and alert. The moment she stepped inside, she paused. "It smells like cedarwood and dust," she said. "Just like when he was here." They led her upstairs. She stopped at the study door and tilted her head. "He used to sit in there for hours. I visited once years ago." He recited King Lear to an empty chair, just to hear how it sounded in that room. They showed her the script pages, the trunk, even the photographs. She didn't act surprised. "You know," she said softly, running a finger along the edge of the desk, "he never wanted to leave this house, even after his heart surgery. When people asked if he'd sell and move somewhere easier to manage, he said." She paused, then smiled sadly. "A man can't leave his stage mid-performance. That would be rude." Paul stood stiff in the doorway, his voice low. "We think he never did leave." Marian nodded slowly. "If he's still here, he's not angry, but he's unresolved. He spent his life pretending to be others. Maybe now he's trying to remember who he was." She turned to Elaine. "You live in his memory now, and he in yours." That evening, the mirror returned to normal. But the house had changed again. Not darker, just more present. Every creak in the floor felt like a whisper. Every lamp flicker like a breath. The radio turned itself on at odd times, often landing on static until you listened close. Buried in the noise was speech. Rhythmic, measured, like lines from a play. Paul started writing again. Nothing much, just scribbles. But sometimes, when he left the room and returned, his pages had changed. Words rearranged. Punctuation corrected. As if edited by an invisible hand. And Elaine, she began talking aloud in empty rooms. Not afraid, but as though in rehearsal. By late February, the Whitakers had grown accustomed to living in the house as one might live backstage during a long-running production, aware they weren't alone, but respectful of the silence between cues. The disturbances never became violent. There were no slammed doors, no thrown objects, no blood on the walls. But the presence had matured. It was no longer fleeting or accidental. It had intention, and now it engaged. It began with the mirror. One morning, Elaine entered the study and found it glowing again, dimly, like the warm haze of stage lights before a curtain rises. The surface no longer reflected the room, but showed a small black box theater. Dust motes floated in golden beams of light, empty chairs stood in rows, and a single figure moved about on stage, muttering lines under his breath, repeating them, searching for rhythm. Richard Griffiths, thinner, younger than the photos, a phantom of concentration, tapping his temple with a pencil, mouthing lines with his back to the mirror. Elaine sat in the chair across from the mirror, watching him for nearly an hour. He never acknowledged her. But when she stood to leave, he turned slightly, not enough to meet her eyes, but enough to reveal a weariness in his face, as though the weight of 1,000 roles still lived behind his features. That night, Paul said he dreamt of applause. Deafening. Not for him. Not for anyone. Just the house. A theater filled with shadows clapping for the space itself. A week later, on a particularly still evening, something changed. It was Elaine who first felt it, the sense that the house was breathing, in and out, waiting. The silence was not emptiness, but a pause, the kind that comes before the final scene. She found the mirror glowing again, but this time, the seats were full. Not with people, but with shapes. Blurred figures. Guests without features. An audience built from smoke and memory. On the stage, a single chair. A script in the seat. Then came the sound of a door creaking above. Paul had gone up to the attic. She followed, slowly, the wooden ladder cold beneath her hands. He stood there, frozen before the open trunk, holding something in his hands. A black cloak, heavy, woolen, the kind an actor would wear for Prospero or Lear. The mirror in the study began to hum. They didn't speak. Paul stepped down, cloak over his shoulders, and crossed into the study like a man called to a pulpit. The mirror shone brighter now, the chairs flickering, the theater behind it glowing as if lit from some invisible source. He stood before it, and then, without knowing why, he read aloud the first page from the script that had appeared there days ago. It was new. Not Shakespeare, not Chekhov, something else. A man must speak, not to be heard, but to remember he has a voice. Elaine sat down in the corner of the study, tears rising without warning. As Paul read, the figure on stage, Richard, finally stopped pacing. He turned, faced the audience, faced Paul. For the first time, he smiled. Not wistfully, not sadly, but with gratitude. And then, with the soft rumble of distant applause, the mirror dimmed. The glow receded, and the study filled with silence so complete, it felt like a held breath exhaled at last. After that night, the house changed. It was warmer, still old, still creaky, but no longer tense. Elaine swore the hallway mirror no longer showed anything strange. Paul stopped writing in the margins of his books and instead took up acting at the local amateur theater for the first time in his life. They stayed, not out of obligation, but because the house had become part of them. A living echo, the kind of place where ghosts don't haunt in rage or sorrow but in memory. They kept the study exactly as it was. The desk, the chair, the mirror, and once a year, on the night of Richard Griffiths' death, they lit a single candle in the window and left the door open to the study. Sometimes, they hear soft footsteps overhead. Sometimes the faint crack of applause. But mostly they hear nothing at all. And in that silence, something sacred lives. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.